Think you really know history? In our last video, we took a hammer to some of the most cherished stories from our past. We learned that the pyramids were a feat of paid, skilled engineering, not slave labor, that Cleopatra, the icon of Egypt, was actually Greek, and that the idea of a flat earth-believing Middle Ages was a fiction invented to make a later age feel superior. The response was overwhelming, and it confirmed a powerful truth: history is not just a collection of facts. It's a story. And like any story, it can be twisted, embellished, weaponized, or just plain misremembered. But if you thought we emptied the vault, you couldn't be more wrong. We've barely scratched the surface. For every myth we busted, there are a dozen more lurking in our textbooks, our movies, and our collective consciousness. These are the tales that are so good, so dramatic, they simply feel like they should be true. Today, we're going deeper. This isn't just a sequel, it's a full-blown historical investigation. We're going to fulfill the promises we made last time and finally tackle the legends of the gladiators, the Vikings, and Napoleon. But we're not stopping there. We will journey from the heart of the Roman Empire to the shores of the New World, from the castles of medieval Europe to the battlefields of the modern era. We will explore not just what the truth is, but why the myths were born in the first place. So, get comfortable. We're setting the record straight again, and this time, we're leaving no stone unturned. The past is about to look a whole lot different, again. We begin our journey in the ancient world, an era of epic empires, legendary warriors, and larger-than-life rulers. These are the stories that form the very bedrock of Western civilization, taught to us as foundational truths. But the foundation is riddled with cracks, and the truth is often buried under centuries of legend. Picture the Colosseum in your mind. The roar of 80,000 spectators, the blistering Roman sun beating down on the sand of the arena. Two warriors, sculpted by years of training, circle each other. One wields a net and trident, the other a short sword and shield. The clash of steel echoes through the stadium. Finally, one man is disarmed and brought to his knees. He raises a single finger, a plea for mercy. All eyes turn to the emperor's box. The crowd is screaming for blood. The emperor, with a cold, impassive face, gives the iconic gesture thumbs down. The victor hesitates for a moment, then plunges his sword into the defeated man's heart. This is the image of gladiatorial combat that Hollywood has sold us for decades. It's a vision of relentless carnage, a state-sponsored death match where only one man could walk out alive. It's a powerful and brutal story. And it's largely a fantasy. The truth is, gladiatorial combat was, first and foremost, a business. And the gladiators themselves were the star assets. These men were some of the most highly trained and specialized athletes in the ancient world. A promoter, known as a lanista, would invest a fortune into his gladiators. They were housed in special training schools called ludi, where they received extensive coaching, a high-protein diet, and the best medical care available in the Roman world. A top-tier gladiator was an investment equivalent to a modern-day Formula One driver or a champion racehorse. To have that investment killed off every time he stepped into the arena would be a catastrophic business model. No lanista would stay in business for long. Because of this, most fights were not to the death. They were governed by a complex set of rules and were overseen by experienced referees, known as sumaruds, who could stop a fight to prevent a fatal injury. The goal was to put on a show, to display incredible skill, or ars. A fight would often end when one combatant was wounded, the first blood, or when one surrendered by raising his index finger. At this point, the fate of the loser was typically decided by the editor, the sponsor of the games, who would take the crowd's mood into account. But sparing a skilled, crowd-favorite gladiator was common practice. He could live to fight another day, and the fans could see their hero again. Archaeological evidence powerfully supports this. At a recently discovered gladiator cemetery in Ephesus, Turkey, forensic analysis of the skeletons revealed that while the men had suffered horrific injuries in the arena, many of their bones showed signs of healing. These weren't men who fought once and died. They were veterans who fought, were wounded, received medical attention, and recovered to fight again. So what about the death rate? While still a brutal profession, estimates from historical records suggest that in the 1st century CE, a gladiator had roughly a 9 in 10 chance of surviving any given match. And that famous thumbs down gesture for death? It's a complete myth, invented for the 19th century painting Pollice Verso by Jean-Léon Gérôme, which then inspired the movie Gladiator. The actual Roman gesture for death is believed to have been a thumb pointed up, like an unsheathed sword, while a closed fist, pollice compresso, or compressed thumb, likely signified mercy, sheathing the sword and sparing the man's life. The spectacle was in the skill, the drama, and the suspense, not just the certainty of death. It is perhaps the ultimate image of a depraved and incompetent ruler. The year is 64 CE. Rome, the magnificent heart of the world's greatest empire, is being consumed by a sea of fire. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flames rage, leaping from wooden tenements to opulent temples, turning entire districts into ash. And where is the emperor during this catastrophe? The story we all know is that he was perched safely on his palace balcony, not in despair, but with a lyre in hand, or a fiddle, as the myth evolved, composing a song about the fall of Troy, using the destruction of his own city as a twisted artistic inspiration. This image of Emperor Nero, the artist-tyrant, gleefully performing as his people suffered, has cemented his legacy as one of history's greatest monsters. It's a story of staggering narcissism and cruelty. It is also a masterful piece of political character assassination, crafted by his enemies to destroy his reputation for all time. To understand the myth, we first have to understand the man and the city. Rome in 64 CE was a tinderbox. A bustling, overcrowded metropolis of over 1 million people, its narrow, winding streets were packed with multi-story wooden apartment blocks. Fires were a constant and terrifying feature of Roman life. When this particular fire broke out in the merchant area surrounding the Circus Maximus, it spread with terrifying speed. Now, where was Nero? He wasn't on a balcony in Rome. The historical accounts, even those written by his critics like the historian Tacitus, place him at his seaside villa in Antium, about 35 miles away, when the fire began. When word of the disaster reached him, he didn't stay to compose poetry. He raced back to the capital and immediately took charge of the relief efforts. His actions upon returning were not those of a madman. He opened his private gardens and public buildings, like the Pantheon, to shelter the tens of thousands of people left homeless. He constructed temporary housing and ordered food supplies to be brought in from neighboring ports, even lowering the price of grain to prevent starvation. These are the documented actions of a leader responding to a crisis. So, how did this story of a fiddling, uncaring emperor come to be? The answer lies in politics and propaganda. Nero was deeply unpopular with Rome's old money elite, the senatorial class. He was a populist who loved the arts, acting, singing, and poetry, which the Stoic, traditional aristocracy viewed as scandalous and deeply un-Roman. The historians who wrote the definitive accounts of his reign, Tacitus and Suetonius, were members of this very class, and they wrote their histories decades after Nero was dead and gone, recording every hostile rumor they could find. Their propaganda was given a huge boost by what Nero did after the fire. On the vast swaths of land that had been cleared by the flames, he began construction on a new, impossibly grand palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was an act of staggering extravagance. For his enemies, this was the smoking gun. They crafted a new narrative. Nero must have started the fire himself, intentionally destroying the city just to make room for his personal pleasure palace. The story of him, fiddling, was the perfect, slanderous detail to seal this image of a monstrous artist who would burn the world for his art. The truth is, while Nero was certainly a brutal and autocratic ruler in many ways, the enduring myth of him playing an instrument while his city burned is a powerful lie, born from a combination of political hatred and a timeless lesson: never let a good crisis go to waste. Let's remain in the Roman world, but move from the bloody sand of the arena to the decadent luxury of a noble's banquet. The scene is one of almost unimaginable excess. Reclining on couches, the Roman elite are presented with an endless parade of exotic dishes: roasted peacocks, flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with honey and nuts. The wine, mixed with spices, flows freely. But the human stomach has its limits. What happens when a wealthy Roman is too full to continue, but the feast has another dozen courses to go? The story we've all heard is that they had a simple, if disgusting, solution. They would excuse themselves and head to a special room, the Vomitorium, where they would intentionally purge the contents of their stomach to make room for more. It's an image that perfectly captures the stereotype of Roman gluttony and decay. It's a fantastic story, a memorable detail, and it's based on a complete misunderstanding of a single Latin word. A vomitorium was not a room for vomiting. It was a crucial and brilliant piece of architectural engineering. The name comes from the Latin verb vomere, which means to spew forth, or to discharge. But it had nothing to do with the stomach. A vomitorium was a wide passageway in a large public venue, like a theater or, most famously, the Colosseum, through which the massive crowds were spewed forth into the streets after a spectacle. Think about the logistics of the Colosseum. It could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. Without an efficient way to get everyone in and out, it would be a chaotic and dangerous nightmare. The Roman architects designed a system of 76 public entrances and exits, the vomitoria, that allowed the entire crowd to exit the building in a matter of minutes. It was a marvel of crowd control and public safety, a design so effective that its basic principles are still used in the construction of modern stadiums today. So, how did this architectural term become associated with purging at parties? The myth is a cocktail of two ingredients: a grain of truth about Roman excess, and a later linguistic mix-up. Roman writers, especially satirists like Seneca and Petronius, did indeed write scathingly about the gluttonous habits of the super-rich. They described lavish banquets where hosts would spend a fortune on a single meal, and where some guests would indeed eat to the point of sickness. This was real, but it was seen as shameful and grotesque behavior, characteristic of a tiny, morally corrupt sliver of the elite, not a common or accepted practice. The term, vomitorium, in its architectural sense was popularized by a writer named Macrobius in the 5th century. The connection to purging seems to have been made much later, likely in the 18th or 19th centuries, when writers rediscovered these classical texts. They read the satirical accounts of gluttony. They saw this architectural term that sounded too perfect to be a coincidence, and they conflated the two, creating a myth that has been stubbornly lodged in our popular culture ever since. The Romans gave us many things: aqueducts, roads, laws, but a designated room for throwing up at a dinner party was not one of them. Of all the societies of the ancient world, none captures the imagination quite like Sparta. They were a people who elevated warfare to a state religion, a society that valued discipline, sacrifice, and the strength of the collective above all else. From the brutal training of the Gogh that began in childhood, to the legendary last stand at Thermopylae, the Spartan name has become a byword for unyielding toughness. And at the very heart of this legend is a story of unimaginable ruthlessness, a practice that supposedly forged their warrior society from the moment of birth. The story is as simple as it is chilling. When a Spartan child was born, it was not presented to its parents, but to a council of elders. These elders would inspect the infant for any sign of physical imperfection, weakness, or deformity. If the child was deemed fit and strong, it was returned to its family to be raised. But if it failed this brutal inspection, its fate was sealed. The elders would order the baby to be taken to a deep chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetos, a place known as the Apothetai, or the deposits, and cast it into the darkness to die. This state-sanctioned infanticide, we are told, was the cornerstone of Spartan eugenics, the ultimate expression of their belief that only the strong deserve to live. This powerful and disturbing image comes to us almost entirely from one source, the Greek writer Plutarch, in his Life of Lycurgus. But here is the crucial context. Plutarch was writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, a Greek intellectual living under Roman rule. He was describing Spartan customs that were already ancient history, writing over 700 years after the events he was describing. He was a biographer and a moral philosopher, not a modern historian, and he often used the Spartans as a romanticized example of virtue and discipline to critique the perceived softness of his own time. His account was never meant to be a literal, journalistic report. For centuries, his story was taken as fact. But in the modern era, archaeologists decided to investigate. They began a systematic excavation of the chasm at the Apothetai, the very spot where thousands of infants were supposedly thrown. What they found was stunning. They did find human remains, but they did not belong to newborns. The skeletal remains recovered from the chasm were exclusively those of adolescents and adults, ranging in age from 18 to 35. The evidence strongly suggests that the Apothetai was not a place for disposing of infants, but rather a pit of execution for criminals, traitors, and prisoners of war, a grim practice, but a very different one. So, what is the truth? Did the Spartans cherish all their children? Almost certainly not. The reality is likely a version of a practice that was tragically common throughout the ancient world, infant exposure. A baby that was unwanted, whether for perceived weakness, an ill omen, or simply because the family couldn't afford to raise it, would be abandoned and left to the elements. The key difference in Sparta was that this decision was likely not left to the father, as it was in Athens, but was made by the state, the council of elders. An infant deemed unfit was probably exposed, but not in a dramatic, ritualistic cliff-tossing ceremony. The myth of the cliff persists because it is a perfect, if horrifying, metaphor. It encapsulates everything we think we know about Sparta, their obsession with physical perfection, their subordination of the individual to the state, and their absolute ruthlessness. It's a far more dramatic and memorable story than the more mundane, though still tragic, reality. The legend of the Apothetai is a powerful piece of historical branding, but the evidence tells us it is a legend, not a literal truth. We now leave the crumbling marble of the ancient world and enter the era that has arguably suffered more historical slander than any other, the Middle Ages. The very name we use for it, coined by Renaissance thinkers who saw it as a long, barbaric gap between their time and the glories of Rome, paints a picture of 1,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and brutality. We imagine a world of constant warfare, where science and learning vanished, and life for the common person was nothing but mud, misery, and oppression. But the greatest myth of all is that the era was ever truly dark. This was the age that saw the birth of the university, the construction of the great cathedrals, incredible innovations in agriculture and engineering, and the preservation of classical knowledge in monasteries across the continent. It was a complex and dynamic period, and the cartoonish stories we tell about it often hide a much more fascinating and illuminated reality. Our first myth from this era is perhaps the most iconic piece of historical costuming ever conceived. Ask anyone, from a child to a history professor, to draw a Viking, and the result will be almost universal. They will draw a large, bearded, fearsome warrior, perhaps holding an axe, and on his head they will place a helmet adorned with two magnificent, curving horns. This image is the absolute, quintessential symbol of the Viking Age. It's in our movies, our comic books, our fantasy novels, and it's the proud logo of the Minnesota Vikings football team. It is so deeply embedded in our culture that it feels like an unshakable historical fact. Yet, there is not a single shred of archaeological or historical evidence to suggest that Viking warriors ever wore horned helmets in battle. Let's start with the archaeology. Over the last century and a half, thousands of Viking graves have been excavated across Scandinavia and the British Isles. We have found their swords, their axes, their shields, and their jewelry. We have even found their helmets. The most famous example, the Jormungba helmet, discovered in a chieftain's grave in Norway, is a simple, practical iron cap with a spectacle-like guard around the eyes and nose. Other fragments and depictions show similar designs, simple, rounded, or conical, Spangenhelm style caps, designed to deflect blows effectively. None of them have horns. Now, let's think about it from a practical, tactical perspective. A horned helmet would be a catastrophic liability in the chaos of a shield wall. The horns would serve no defensive purpose. Instead, they would act as perfect handles for an enemy to grab and control your head, or worse, they could catch the blow of a sword or an axe, preventing it from glancing off and instead transferring the full, neck-snapping force of the impact directly to the wearer. It is, in short, a suicidal piece of headwear for a warrior. So if the Vikings didn't wear them, where did this incredibly persistent myth come from? The story begins not in the 9th century, but in the 19th. The 1800s saw a huge surge of romantic nationalism across Europe, and artists and writers in Scandinavia and Germany became fascinated with their ancient Norse and Germanic past. They began to paint epic, dramatic scenes from the sagas and myths. In 1876, this romantic vision reached its peak with the premiere of Richard Wagner's monumental opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen. The costume designer for the opera, Carl Emil Doppler, created dramatic costumes for his Norse characters, and for the villains, he designed intimidating helmets with horns. The image was an instant sensation. It was powerful, theatrical, and visually unforgettable. It perfectly captured the 19th century idea of the noble savage, or the barbarian warrior. The image spread like wildfire through popular illustrations, advertisements, and books, and within a generation, the fictional opera costume had completely replaced the historical reality in the public imagination. The horned helmet is a testament not to Viking culture, but to the power of 19th century romanticism and the enduring magic of the theater. If the horned helmet is the most famous symbol of the medieval warrior, then our next myth is the most infamous symbol of medieval justice. It is a device that seems born from the darkest corners of the human imagination, a machine of almost unparalleled cruelty. We are, of course, talking about the Iron Maiden. The image is seared into our minds from horror movies and museum displays. A tall, human-shaped iron cabinet, often with a serene, motherly face sculpted on the front, stands waiting. The doors swing open to reveal a horrifying interior lined with long, sharp iron spikes. The victim, a heretic or a traitor, is forced inside. The heavy doors are slowly closed, and the spikes are strategically placed not to kill instantly, but to puncture the body in numerous places, the arms, the legs, the torso, the eyes, ensuring a slow, agonizing, and terrifying death as the victim bleeds out in the suffocating darkness. It is presented as the ultimate expression of medieval sadism, a perfect symbol for the barbarity of the Dark Ages. It is a truly horrifying invention. And it has one fundamental problem: it's a complete fake. The Iron Maiden is not a medieval torture device. It is a historical hoax, a macabre fantasy created centuries later to satisfy a morbid fascination with a past that never existed. If you search the vast historical records of the Middle Ages, the court documents, the legal codes, the chronicles, the personal letters, you will find no mention of an Iron Maiden. Not one. For a device so spectacular, and so terrifying, its complete absence from the historical record is deafening. Medieval torture was certainly real and brutal, but it was generally simpler, employing devices like the rack, the thumbscrew, or the wheel. The complex, mechanically sophisticated Iron Maiden is nowhere to be found. So where did it come from? The story of the Iron Maiden begins not in the 14th or 15th century, but at the end of the 18th century, during the Age of Enlightenment. In 1793, a German philosopher and archaeologist named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote a sensationalist story about a supposed execution that took place in Nuremberg in the year 1515. He described, in lurid detail, a coin forger being killed inside an iron cabinet with internal spikes. This was not a historical account. It was a piece of creative fiction, a ghost story meant to shock and entertain his readers. But his story planted a seed. In the early 19th century, as tourism began to flourish, museums and private collectors sought out macabre artifacts to attract visitors. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, which became the blueprint for all others, was constructed around 1802. It was likely pieced together from various unrelated objects. The body was probably an authentic medieval shame cloak, a barrel-like device used for public humiliation, not torture, and the spikes and elaborate head were added later to match Siebenkees' fictional description. It was a brilliant piece of showmanship, a historical Frankenstein, created to be a sensational tourist trap. The myth was so successful because it perfectly confirmed what people of the 19th century wanted to believe about the Middle Ages, that it was a primitive, superstitious, and monstrously cruel time, from which they, the enlightened moderns, had thankfully escaped. The Iron Maiden tells us nothing about the reality of medieval justice, but it tells us everything about the morbid imagination and historical biases of the Victorian era. It is a ghost story that managed to convince the world it was real. Let's move away from the dungeons and battlefields and talk about the everyday life of a person in the Middle Ages. If you were to ask a simple question, how long did they live? The answer you most likely get is a grim one. The average life expectancy was only about 30 years old. This single statistic paints a bleak and powerful picture. It suggests a world where life was brutally short, where everyone was considered old by their mid-20s, and where reaching the age of 40 was a remarkable achievement. We imagine a society populated almost entirely by the very young, a world without the wisdom and experience of its elders. This image of a fleeting, truncated lifespan is one of the most fundamental ways we misunderstand the medieval world. The statistic isn't a lie, but it is profoundly misleading, and the truth it hides is far more nuanced and interesting. The problem lies in the word average. That low number of 30 to 35 years is so skewed by one tragic and overwhelming factor: incredibly high infant and child mortality. In a world without modern sanitation, without antibiotics, and with a limited understanding of germ theory, childhood was the most dangerous time of life. Diseases that we now consider minor, like strep throat or diarrhea, could be a death sentence for a baby or a toddler. Malnutrition, accidents, and the immense dangers of childbirth for both mother and child meant that a staggering number of people never even made it to their 5th birthday. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3, or even 1 in 2, children died before reaching adulthood. When you factor all of those tragic early deaths into the mathematical average, the overall number plummets. It creates a statistical illusion. The key to understanding medieval life is not the average at birth, but the life expectancy of someone who survived the gauntlet of childhood. If a medieval person, whether a peasant or a nobleman, managed to survive the diseases and dangers of their early years and reach the age of 21, their prospects for a long life changed dramatically. A man who reached adulthood could reasonably expect to live into his 50s or early 60s. A woman who survived her childbearing years had a similar life expectancy. And living well beyond that was by no means a rarity. You only need to look at the historical record. We have countless examples of prominent figures living what we would consider a full life. The famous medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas lived to be 49. The formidable Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine lived to the ripe old age of 82. The English King Edward III reigned for 50 years and died at 64. And these are not just isolated cases among the well-fed elite. Parish records and archaeological evidence from peasant cemeteries show that a significant portion of the working population who survived childhood lived into their 50s and 60s. The medieval world was not a world without old people. It was a world where becoming old was a hard-won privilege. It was a society that tragically lost a huge portion of its population before they had a chance to grow, but for those who did, the reward was a lifespan not dramatically shorter than that of many people in the early 20th century. The myth of the 30-year lifespan makes us see the past as a foreign country of fleeting lives, when in reality, the fundamental human experience of growing up, growing old, and gathering wisdom was very much the same. Of all the myths that paint the Middle Ages as a time of brutal oppression, few are as powerful or as personal as the droit du Seigneur, or the right of the Lord. The concept is as simple as it is monstrous, and it has been immortalized in countless books and movies, most famously in the film Braveheart. The story goes like this. Under the feudal system, a local lord held absolute power over the serfs who lived and worked on his land. This power was so total that it extended into the most intimate moments of their lives. When a young peasant couple got married, the lord had the legal right to take the place of the husband on the wedding night, sleeping with the new bride before her marriage could be consummated. This alleged practice is presented as the ultimate symbol of aristocratic tyranny and the complete dehumanization of the common people. It's a story of institutionalized sexual assault, a perfect encapsulation of the phrase, "Power corrupts absolutely." It is a truly vile and disgusting concept. And for that, we should be thankful that it is a complete and utter myth. There is not a single shred of credible, verifiable evidence that the droit du Seigneur ever existed as a legally recognized right in medieval Europe. For centuries, historians and legal scholars have scoured the vast archives of the medieval period. They have examined feudal law codes, court records, land charters, and personal correspondence from across the continent. And they have found nothing. There is no law on the books. There is no record of a court case where a peasant sued his lord for exercising this right, or where a lord was punished for failing to do so. For a practice so widespread and so fundamental to the feudal system, as the myth suggests, its complete and total absence from the historical and legal record is the most powerful evidence against it. So, if it never existed, where did this incredibly persistent and lurid story come from? The myth of the first night is not a medieval reality, but an early modern invention. Its origins can be traced to the 16th century, but it truly gained its power during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. Writers and philosophers of that era, like Voltaire, were engaged in a fierce intellectual and political battle against the absolute monarchies and the entrenched aristocracy of their own time. To make their case for liberty and reform, they looked to the past. They created a caricature of the Middle Ages, painting it as a time of superstitious ignorance and barbaric tyranny. The fictional droit du seigneur was the perfect weapon in their arsenal. They presented it as a historical fact to prove that the aristocracy had always been corrupt and depraved, and that their power was fundamentally illegitimate. It was a brilliant and effective piece of anti-aristocratic propaganda. The story was so scandalous and so memorable that it took on a life of its own. It was repeated by later writers, picked up by novelists and playwrights, and eventually, it became so ingrained in our popular culture that it was accepted as a genuine medieval practice. While there is no doubt that powerful medieval lords could, and certainly did, abuse their subjects in countless ways, including sexually, this was a brutal abuse of power, not the exercising of a legally sanctioned right. The myth of the first knight tells us nothing about the laws of the Middle Ages, but it tells us a great deal about the political battles of the Enlightenment. We end our journey through the so-called Dark Ages with a story that is less about brutality and more about bravery, a tale of civic virtue and female empowerment that has become one of England's most enduring legends. It is the story of Lady Godiva. The legend, as it's famously told, takes place in the 11th century Anglo-Saxon town of Coventry. The townspeople are suffering under the weight of oppressive and crippling taxes levied by their ruler, Leofric, the powerful Earl of Mercia. His kind-hearted wife, Lady Godiva, is moved by their plight and repeatedly pleads with her husband to show mercy and lower the taxes. Leofric, annoyed by her persistence, finally agrees, but on one seemingly impossible and humiliating condition. He will grant her request if she agrees to ride on horseback, completely naked, through the town's marketplace at midday. He assumes this will silence her for good. To his astonishment, she agrees. In an act of incredible courage and solidarity with the people, she lets down her long hair to act as a cloak, covering most of her body, and makes the famous ride. The townspeople, in a display of immense gratitude and respect for her sacrifice, all agree to stay inside their homes, shutter their windows, and avert their eyes as she passes. All, that is, except for one man, a tailor who would later be named Tom. Overcome by curiosity, he bores a hole in his shutters to catch a glimpse of the noblewoman. As the legend goes, he is immediately struck blind by a divine power for his voyeurism, becoming the original Peeping Tom. Leofric, humbled and true to his word, abolishes the harsh taxes. It is a magnificent story. It has everything: a cruel ruler, a virtuous heroine, a dramatic public act, and a satisfying moral conclusion. It has inspired countless paintings, poems, and even a brand of chocolates. It is a cornerstone of English folklore. And it is almost certainly just that, a story. The first problem is the timeline. The historical Lady Godiva, or Godiva, in Old English, was a real person. She and her husband Leofric were powerful and wealthy nobles in the mid-11th century. And they were known for their piety and generosity, especially as patrons of the Benedictine monastery in Coventry. However, the story of her naked ride does not appear in any of the contemporary chronicles written during her lifetime. The first written account of the ride emerges nearly 100 years after her death, in the Chronicles of Roger of Wendover, a monk writing in the early 13th century. As the story was retold by later chroniclers, it was embellished and expanded, with new details being added over time. The most famous part of the story, the character of Peeping Tom, is an even later invention. He doesn't make an appearance in any version of the legend until the 16th century, a full 500 years after the supposed event. This gradual addition of dramatic elements is a classic sign of a story evolving from a historical memory into a popular folk tale. While the historical Godiva was undoubtedly a respected and generous figure, The story of her ride is likely a moral fable, a piece of folklore that attached itself to her name long after she was gone. It's a legend that celebrates the power of a noble individual to stand up against tyranny, and the importance of civic duty and respect. It's a powerful and inspiring tale, but it belongs to the realm of folklore, not documented history. We now move forward in time, into an age of upheaval and transformation. The world is expanding, old empires are clashing, and new nations are being forged in the fires of revolution. This is an era defined by larger-than-life figures, ambitious monarchs, swashbuckling pirates, and visionary founders. Their actions shaped the modern world, and their stories have been polished into shining legends. But as we've learned, the more polished the legend, the more likely it is to be hiding a much more complex, and often much more interesting, truth. Our first myth from this era concerns one of the most towering figures in history, who has been forever defined by the idea that he wasn't towering at all. There are few names in history that command as much attention as Napoleon Bonaparte. A military genius, a brilliant administrator, a boundless egomaniac, he rose from obscurity to become the Emperor of France and the master of continental Europe. His ambition redrew the map of the world. Yet, for all his monumental achievements, the single most famous physical detail about him is that he was short. Comically, famously short. The image is a cultural staple. We picture a tiny, petulant tyrant, stuffing his hand in his waistcoat, perpetually angry at the world. His supposed small stature has given us a psychological term, the Napoleon complex, used to describe an inferiority complex that causes people, especially shorter men, to become overly aggressive and domineering. This caricature of a miniature, angry general is one of the most enduring in all of history. It is also one of the most successful and brilliant pieces of enemy propaganda ever devised. The myth of Napoleon's height is a classic case of a lie being lost in translation. At the time of his death in 1821, an autopsy was performed, and his height was recorded by his French physician as 5 pieds 2 pouces, or 5 feet 2 inches. And if you take that at face value, he does indeed sound very short. However, the crucial detail is that this was measured using the pre-revolutionary French system of measurement, the pieds du roi. The French foot, and therefore the French inch, was significantly longer than its British imperial counterpart. When you convert Napoleon's recorded height of 5 feet, 2 French inches into the modern, or British imperial system, it comes out to approximately 5 feet 6.5 inches, or about 1.69 meters. Now, how does that stack up? The average height for a French man in the early 19th century was around 5 feet 5 inches. This means that Napoleon, far from being a tiny man, was actually slightly taller than the average citizen of his country. So, if he was of average height, why does the myth of his smallness persist so stubbornly? The answer lies with his greatest enemies, the British. While Napoleon was conquering Europe, the British, safe on their island, fought him not just with cannons, but with cartoons. The golden age of British political satire, led by brilliant and vicious artists like James Gillray, weaponized Napoleon's image. In hundreds of popular and widely circulated prints, they depicted him as a tiny, infantile figure, often no bigger than a child. They nicknamed him Little Boney, and drew him being disciplined by the towering figure of John Bull, the personification of England, or throwing tantrums at the feet of British admirals. This visual propaganda was incredibly effective. It cut the terrifying, Corsican ogre down to size, making him seem ridiculous and non-threatening to the British public. The image was so powerful and so relentlessly repeated that it completely overrode the reality. This was compounded by the fact that Napoleon was often surrounded by his elite imperial guard, who were all required to be men of above-average height, which would have made him appear shorter by comparison in official portraits. The legend of the tiny emperor is a masterclass in propaganda, a testament to the old saying that the pen, or in this case, the cartoonist's ink, is mightier than the sword. We now cross the Atlantic to the fledgling English colonies of North America, to a dark and infamous chapter in American history. The year is 1692. In the small, isolated Puritan community of Salem Village, Massachusetts, a strange affliction befalls a group of young girls. They convulse, they scream, they claim to be tormented by invisible forces. Under pressure from local magistrates, they begin to name names, accusing members of their community of witchcraft. What follows is a wave of paranoia and hysteria that engulfs the entire region. Over the next year, more than 200 people are accused of colluding with the devil. Neighbor turns against neighbor, reason gives way to fear, and the legal system is twisted to serve a terrifying moral panic. At the heart of our memory of this event is a single, horrifying image: the accused, mostly women, being dragged to the center of the village, tied to a wooden stake, as the righteous Puritan community lights a pyre at their feet, burning the evil out of their midst. This image of witches burning at the stake is a powerful and archetypal one. It is the scene we see in countless movies and television shows about the Salem witch trials. It is the definitive punishment for a witch in our collective imagination. There is just one problem: it never happened in Salem. Not once. The myth of the Salem burnings is a classic case of historical conflation, where we take a practice from one time and place and incorrectly apply it to another. The practice of burning heretics and witches at the stake was indeed common in continental Europe, especially during the height of the Inquisition. Under the legal systems of the Holy Roman Empire, witchcraft was considered a crime of heresy, a betrayal of God, and purification by fire was seen as the appropriate, symbolic punishment. Thousands of people were executed this way across Germany, France, Switzerland, and Italy. But the colony of Massachusetts Bay in the 17th century was not part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was an English colony, and it operated under English law. And under English law, witchcraft was not treated as a religious crime of heresy. It was treated as a secular crime, a felony, specifically the crime of conjuring spirits. As such, the prescribed method of execution was the same as for other serious felonies like murder or piracy: hanging. The historical record of the Salem witch trials is tragically clear. Of the hundreds accused, 19 people were convicted and executed. All 19 of them, 14 women and 5 men, were taken to a place called Gallows Hill, just outside of town, and hanged. A 20th victim, an elderly and defiant farmer named Giles Corey, suffered a different, but equally horrific fate. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, a tactic to prevent his trial from proceeding and thus prevent the state from legally seizing his property and disinheriting his sons. For his refusal, the court subjected him to an archaic and brutal legal procedure called peine forte et dure, or hard and forceful punishment. He was laid on the ground, a wooden board was placed on his chest, and heavy stones were slowly piled on top of him over 2 days in an attempt to force him to plead. He refused to the very end, his last words famously being, "More weight." He was pressed to death. The Salem witch trials were a horrific and shameful event, a perfect storm of social stress, religious extremism, and legal failure. The reality of what happened, the hangings and the crushing, is gruesome enough. The myth of the burnings is a powerful but inaccurate echo, a story that confuses the specific history of colonial America with the broader, and bloodier, history of the European witch hunts. Let's leave the grim shores of colonial New England and head south, to the warm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean during the golden age of piracy. This was a brief but spectacular era, from roughly 1690 to 1730, when infamous figures with names like Calico Jack Rackham, Black Bart, Roberts, and the most fearsome of them all, Blackbeard, ruled the waves. Our modern image of these pirates is a rich tapestry of adventure and romance. We picture them with parrots on their shoulders, walking on peg legs, and speaking in a thick West Country accent. But the single most important element of the pirate legend, the very goal of their swashbuckling existence, is the treasure. We imagine chests overflowing with gold doubloons, silver pieces of 8, and glittering jewels. And what did they do with this fabulous wealth? The story we all know is that they sailed to a deserted island, a secret cove, and buried the chest deep in the sand, marking the spot with a cryptic X on a secret map, to be recovered at a later date. This idea of buried pirate treasure is the engine of some of our greatest adventure stories, from Treasure Island to the Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise. It is the ultimate pirate fantasy. And that's precisely what it is, a fantasy. The historical reality is that pirates almost never buried their treasure. To understand why, you have to understand the reality of a pirate's life and the economy of a pirate ship. First, a pirate's career was, on average, brutally short. Most pirates were active for only a year or two before they were captured, killed in battle, or succumbed to disease or accident. They lived for the moment, not for long-term financial planning. The idea of burying their wealth for a far-off retirement that would almost certainly never come was completely alien to their mindset. Treasure wasn't for hoarding, it was for spending, and spending it as quickly and as lavishly as possible. As soon as a pirate ship made port in a friendly haven like Nassau or Port Royal, the crew would descend upon the taverns, brothels, and gambling dens, often blowing their entire share of a haul in a matter of days or weeks. The treasure was the fuel for a massive, fleeting party before they headed back out to sea to risk their lives again. Second, a pirate ship was a surprisingly democratic institution. Before a voyage, the crew would draw up and sign a set of articles, which laid out the rules of the ship and, most importantly, the exact distribution of any loot that was captured. The captain typically received only 1.5 or 2 shares, the same as the quartermaster. Every crew member got their designated portion. For a captain to try and secretly bury a portion of the ship's collective treasure would be a direct violation of the articles. It would be seen as theft from his own crew, an act that would almost certainly lead to a mutiny and a swift, violent death. So where did this incredibly powerful myth come from? It can be traced almost entirely to one, possibly 2, real-world cases that were then wildly sensationalized. The most famous is the case of Captain William Kidd, a Scottish privateer who was commissioned to hunt pirates, but eventually turned to piracy himself. In 1699, knowing he was a wanted man, Kidd did bury a small cache of treasure on Gardiner's Island, off the coast of New York, likely as a desperate, last-ditch attempt to hide evidence, and use it as a bargaining chip. The treasure was quickly located by the authorities and used as evidence against him at his trial. This single, real-life case of a pirate burying treasure became the seed of a legend. It was then watered and grown into the mighty oak of myth by fiction writers, most notably Robert Louis Stevenson in his 1883 masterpiece, Treasure Island. His story, with its unforgettable characters like Long John Silver and its central plot device of Captain Flint's treasure map, single-handedly invented the modern pirate genre and forever cemented the idea of buried treasure in the popular imagination. It's a brilliant story, but it's not history. From the high seas of the Caribbean, we now travel to the dusty plains of the American West. It is the late 19th century, the era of the great cattle drives, a time of rugged individualism and the forging of the American frontier. And at the center of this era is its most iconic figure, the cowboy. Try to picture a cowboy in your mind. What does he look like? He's probably sitting tall in the saddle, wearing leather chaps, scuffed boots with spurs, and most importantly, on his head, he's wearing a wide-brimmed, high-crowned hat. For most of us, that hat is a Stetson, the legendary boss of the plains. It is the single most defining piece of Western wear, an unmistakable symbol of the American cowboy, as essential to his identity as his horse or his revolver. It is the crown of the King of the West. This image is so powerful, so ingrained in our culture through a century of movies, television, and advertising, that it feels like an absolute truth. But if you could travel back in time to a real cattle drive on the Chisholm Trail in the 1870s and take a look at the men working the herd, you would find that the iconic Stetson cowboy hat was a rare sight indeed. The most popular, most common, and most practical hat in the American West was something far less romantic, the bowler hat. That's right, the bowler, or the derby, as it was known in America. The stiff, rounded hat we associate with Victorian city dwellers in London or New York was the true king of headwear on the frontier. You only need to look at the photographic evidence from the period. Take a look at a picture of the famous Wild Bunch gang. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are not wearing Stetsons. They are wearing bowler hats. Look at the legendary lawmen of the era, like Bat Masterson or Wyatt Earp. In their most famous portraits, they are almost always pictured wearing a bowler. The reason was simple practicality. The West was a windy, dusty, and often violent place. A wide-brimmed hat like the Stetson was easily caught by the wind and blown off a rider's head. The bowler, being smaller, stiffer, and fitting more snugly on the head, was far more likely to stay put during a gallop or a gust of wind. They were also more durable and offered better protection in a fight. They were the practical, everyday choice for a working man on the frontier. Other common styles included flat-brimmed pork pie hats, old Civil War caps, or simple, floppy wool hats. So how did the Stetson become the undisputed symbol of the West? The answer lies not in history, but in Hollywood. The Stetson Company was a brilliant marketer, and its boss of the plains motto, introduced in 1865, was certainly available. But its legendary status was cemented in the early 20th century with the birth of the Western movie genre. The first great Western movie star, Tom Mix, adopted the Stetson as his signature look. Later, towering figures like Gary Cooper and most famously, John Wayne, made the high-crowned Stetson their trademark. Hollywood filmmakers weren't interested in historical accuracy. They were interested in creating a powerful and instantly recognizable heroic archetype. The wide-brimmed Stetson framed the hero's face perfectly, creating a silhouette of rugged authority against the vast Western landscape. The image was so effective that it completely overwrote the more mundane historical reality. The Stetson is a magnificent piece of American iconography, but it is a symbol of the myth of the West, not the reality of the working cowboy. Following directly from the myth of the cowboy's attire is the myth of the world he inhabited. The American Wild West. The very name conjures a vivid and violent picture. We imagine a land of untamed, lawless frontiers, where life was cheap and disputes were settled by the speed of a man's draw. We see dusty main streets in towns like Dodge City and Tombstone, where tumbleweeds roll past swinging saloon doors, and where high-noon gunfights between steely-eyed lawmen and black-hatted outlaws were a regular occurrence. This vision of a society teetering on the brink of anarchy, where justice came from the barrel of a Colt .45, is the foundational premise of the entire Western genre. It is a world that has captivated audiences for over a century. It is also, for the most part, a dramatic and exciting work of fiction. The real American West was, for the most part, not nearly as wild as its reputation suggests. Let's look at the famous cattle towns, the supposed epicenters of frontier violence. Places like Dodge City, Abilene, and Tombstone are legendary as hotbeds of conflict. But the historical reality is that these towns were, in many ways, far more orderly and regulated than we imagine. One of the first things that happened when a town was established was the passage of strict ordinances to control the very violence we imagine was rampant. And the most common of these ordinances was gun control. That's right, gun control was a fact of life in the Old West. Upon entering the city limits of a town like Dodge City, a cowboy on a cattle drive was legally required to disarm. He had to check his firearms at the sheriff's office or at his hotel, to be picked up only when he was leaving town. Signs were posted at the entrance to town with messages like, "The carrying of firearms is strictly prohibited." The most famous gunfight in American history, the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, was not a random shootout. It was a direct result of Marshal Virgil Earp and his brothers attempting to enforce the town's ordinance against carrying weapons within the city limits against the Clanton and McClory gangs, who had refused to disarm. So what about the body count? Historians and researchers who have dug into the actual data have discovered that the homicide rates in these frontier towns were surprisingly low. The historian Robert Dykstra, in his definitive study of the Kansas cattle towns, found that over the 15-year peak of the cattle drive era, from 1870 to 1885, the total number of homicides in all 5 of the major towns, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge City, and Caldwell, was only 45. That's an average of just 1.5 murders per town, per year. You were far more likely to die from a disease like cholera, a work-related accident, or even a bar fight involving fists and furniture than you were to be killed in a classic, Hollywood-style gunfight. The myth of the lawless, violent West was a product of the 19th century publishing industry. Dime novels, cheap, sensationalist paperbacks, churned out exaggerated tales of real-life figures like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, transforming them into larger-than-life folk heroes and villains. This foundation was then built upon by the 20th century film industry, which found that stories of constant conflict and clear-cut morality made for much more exciting cinema than the more complex reality of community building, legal regulation, and relatively low crime rates. The Wild West is a powerful and enduring piece of American mythology, but the real West was a place where the rule of law was not just a goal, but a daily, and largely successful, practice. We end our tour of this revolutionary era with a story that lies at the very heart of American patriotic folklore. It is a tale taught to schoolchildren for generations, a charming and inspiring account of the birth of the nation's most sacred symbol. It is the story of Betsy Ross and the creation of the first Stars and Stripes. The scene, as the legend goes, takes place in Philadelphia in the spring of 1776, just before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 3 distinguished gentlemen, members of a secret committee from the Continental Congress, pay a visit to the humble upholstery shop of a local seamstress and flag maker named Elizabeth, Betsy, Ross. The men are the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, the wealthy financier of the Revolution, Robert Morris, and a respected statesman, George Ross, the uncle of Betsy's late husband. General Washington himself unfurls a rough sketch of a flag they have designed for the new nation. It features 13 red and white stripes and 13 stars, representing the 13 colonies. Their design, however, has one small flaw: the stars have 6 points. Betsy Ross, a skilled and practical artisan, looks at the design and suggests an improvement. She demonstrates how a 5-pointed star can be cut with a single snip of the scissors, making the design cleaner and easier to produce. The committee is impressed by her ingenuity and commissions her to sew the very first flag for the United States of America. It is a wonderful story. It provides a tangible, human moment for the birth of the flag, and it elevates a working-class woman to the status of a key figure in the American founding, a female counterpart to the famous Founding Fathers. It is a tale of quiet patriotism and female ingenuity. Unfortunately, there is not a single piece of contemporary historical evidence to suggest that any of it ever happened. The story of Betsy Ross does not appear anywhere in the historical record of the 18th century. There are no letters from George Washington, no diary entries, no congressional records, no bills of sale, and no personal correspondence from anyone involved that mentions Betsy Ross, a flag committee, or this famous meeting. The first time the story was told publicly was in 1870, nearly a century after the supposed event. It was relayed by Betsy's grandson, William Canby, in a speech to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. He claimed it was a story that had been passed down in his family for generations, a piece of oral history that he was now sharing with the nation. While Canby genuinely believed the story to be true, he had no evidence to support it beyond family lore. Historians have since pointed out numerous problems with the tale. The Continental Congress did not form a flag committee until 1777, a year after the supposed meeting. And the person who most likely deserves credit for the flag's design is not Betsy Ross, but a man named Francis Hopkinson. Hopkinson was a New Jersey delegate to the Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a talented artist and designer. In 1780, he submitted a detailed bill to Congress for various designs he had created for the new government, including, in his words, the flag of the United States of America. While his claim for payment was ultimately denied over a billing dispute, his initial claim is the strongest and most direct piece of evidence we have for the flag's origin. The story of Betsy Ross emerged at a perfect time, in the years leading up to the nation's centennial celebration in 1876. It was a period of intense patriotism and a desire for inspiring national stories. The tale of the humble seamstress who helped create the nation's banner was a powerful and appealing piece of folklore that quickly captured the public's imagination and became cemented as fact. It is a beloved legend, but a legend nonetheless. We now arrive in the modern age, an era defined by technological marvels, global communication, and unprecedented scientific discovery. You might think that in a world with photography, film, and eventually, the internet, historical myths would become harder to create and easier to debunk. But you'd be wrong. The last 150 years have seen the birth of some of the most stubborn and widespread misconceptions of all. These are the myths that feel like scientific facts, the urban legends that have taken on a life of their own, and the stories that have been shaped and amplified by the very mass media that was supposed to give us a clearer picture of the world. Our first myth from this era is one that attempts to bridge the ancient and the modern, a story that takes one of humanity's greatest ancient wonders and elevates it to an astronomical scale. It is a fact that many of us learned in school. It has been repeated in textbooks, travel guides, and trivia games for generations. The Great Wall of China, a monumental feat of engineering stretching for thousands of miles across the rugged landscape of northern China, is so vast, so immense, that it is the only man-made structure that can be seen with the naked eye by astronauts looking down from space. This statement serves as the ultimate testament to the scale of human achievement. It links the ancient world's most ambitious construction project with the modern era's greatest adventure, the exploration of space. It creates a powerful and awe-inspiring image of the wall as a landmark not just for our world, but for the cosmos. It is a beautiful and poetic idea. And it is completely, unequivocally false. The problem with the myth is a simple matter of physics and optics. While the Great Wall is incredibly, unimaginably long, it is, in relative terms, extremely narrow. At its widest points, the wall is only about 30 feet across. For the most part, it is much narrower. Now, consider the distance. Low Earth orbit, where astronauts on the International Space Station live and work, is at an altitude of about 250 miles. Seeing the Great Wall from that distance would be the equivalent of you trying to see a single human hair from over 2 miles away. It is simply impossible. The wall's color and materials also work against its visibility. It was built from local stone and earth, and its muted, gray-brown color blends in almost perfectly with the surrounding terrain. It does not stand out as a distinct feature against the landscape. But we don't have to rely on theory. We can just ask the people who have actually been there. Since the dawn of the space age, astronaut after astronaut has been asked this question, and their answer has been consistently the same. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, confirmed he could not see it. The American astronaut JAPT famously said, "We've flown over China hundreds of times and I've never seen it." Perhaps most definitively, in 2003, China sent its very first astronaut, Yang Liwei, into orbit. Upon his return, he was asked if he could see his nation's most famous landmark. His answer was a simple and honest, "No." So, what man-made objects can be seen from space? With the naked eye, astronauts can see large-scale features, especially those with high contrast to their surroundings. They can see the lights of major cities on the night side of the Earth. During the day, they can make out large airports, the grid patterns of major cities, and massive structures like the pyramids of Giza, not because of their height, but because they are a distinct, geometric shape in the middle of a plain, empty desert. But the Great Wall remains elusive. The myth itself actually predates the space age by several decades. It seems to have originated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most famously in the 1932 Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon. It was a hypothetical statement, a romantic notion about the grandest structure on Earth. The idea was so compelling that when the space age began, people just assumed it must be true. It's a myth that speaks to our desire to believe in the monumental, but the view from orbit tells a different story. We now turn to the world of art, and to one of its most brilliant, tortured, and mythologized figures, Vincent van Gogh. His vibrant, swirling, and emotionally charged paintings, like the Starry Night and Sunflowers, are some of the most beloved and recognizable works of art in the world. But for all the fame of his art, his life story is equally famous, defined by a narrative of poverty, a lack of recognition, and a descent into madness. And the single, defining event of that madness, the ultimate symbol of the tortured artist, is the story of his ear. The legend is as famous as his paintings. On the night of December 23, 1888, in the town of Arles in the south of France, Van Gogh was living and working with his fellow artist, the volatile and arrogant Paul Gauguin. Their relationship, once hopeful, had soured into a series of bitter arguments. After one particularly explosive confrontation, Gauguin stormed out of their shared home, the Yellow House. Van Gogh, in a fit of despair, rage, and mental anguish, took a straight razor, went to a mirror, and sliced off his own ear. He then wrapped the severed ear in newspaper, went to a local brothel, and presented it to a prostitute named Rachel, before staggering home and collapsing in his blood-soaked bed, where he was discovered by the police the next morning. This act of extreme self-mutilation has become the cornerstone of the Van Gogh legend. It is the ultimate proof of his insanity, a shocking and gruesome act that has been endlessly analyzed by art historians and psychologists. It is a powerful and unforgettable story. But the version we all know, the story of the entire ear, is an exaggeration that has distorted the true, and arguably more tragic, reality of the event. For decades, the only evidence came from conflicting accounts, including those of Gauguin, who had every reason to portray Vincent as completely unhinged. But in the 21st century, new and more definitive evidence has come to light. In 2016, a researcher named Bernadette Murphy, while writing her book Van Gogh's Ear, uncovered a crucial document in an American archive. It was a drawing made by Dr. Felix Ray, the physician who treated Van Gogh in the hospital in Arles immediately after the incident. The drawing, sketched on a prescription pad, was made by the doctor to illustrate the exact nature of the wound for a biographer. It shows, clearly and unambiguously, that Van Gogh did not cut off his entire ear. He severed almost the entire earlobe, and possibly a small part of the lower cartilage of the ear itself. The injury was horrific, bloody, and undoubtedly the act of a man in the throes of a severe mental health crisis. But it was a mutilation of the lobe, not a full amputation of the entire ear. Why does this detail matter? Because the myth of the whole ear creates a caricature. It turns Van Gogh into a one-dimensional madman, a monster of insanity. The reality, while still shocking, is more medically and psychologically plausible. It was a desperate, symbolic act of self-harm, likely committed during a psychotic episode, possibly triggered by a combination of his deteriorating mental health, the conflict with Gogh, and his heavy consumption of absinthe. The story of the entire ear was likely born from a combination of sensationalist newspaper reporting at the time and the natural tendency for a shocking story to become more extreme with each retelling. It was a better, more dramatic story. But the truth, as revealed by the doctor who treated him, gives us a slightly clearer and more human picture of the real tragedy that unfolded on that terrible night in Arles. From the world of art, we turn to the world of science, and to the man whose very name has become synonymous with genius, Albert Einstein. His theories of relativity fundamentally reshaped our understanding of space, time, and gravity. His equation, E equals mc squared, is the most famous in the world. He is the undisputed archetype of the brilliant scientist, the frizzy-haired, deep-thinking titan of the intellect. But there is another, equally popular story that we tell about Einstein. It's a tale of encouragement, a comforting fable that is often told to struggling students. The story goes that the great Albert Einstein, the future Nobel Prize winner, was a terrible student in his youth. He was a daydreamer, a rebel who chafed against the rigid discipline of his German schoolmasters. And most famously, he was so bad at mathematics that he actually failed a math exam in school. This myth is incredibly appealing. It's a classic underdog story. It tells us that it's okay to struggle, that a slow start doesn't preclude a brilliant finish. It suggests that genius can be hidden, that it doesn't always conform to the rigid standards of the classroom. It is a wonderful, inspiring, and motivational tale. And Albert Einstein himself would have told you it was complete nonsense. The myth seems to have started in the 1930s when a "Ripley's Believe It or Not" column printed the fact that the world's greatest living scientist had failed math. The story spread so widely that it eventually made its way back to Einstein himself. When he was shown the article, he is reported to have laughed and said, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus." And the historical record backs him up completely. Far from being a poor student, the young Einstein was an exceptionally gifted one, particularly in the fields of mathematics and physics. He consistently received the highest marks in these subjects. The confusion seems to have arisen from a change in the school's grading system. In 1896, when Einstein was 17 and studying at the Cantonal School in Aarau, Switzerland, the school reversed its marking scale. A 6, which had been the lowest grade, became the highest, and a 1, which had been the highest, became the lowest. Looking at Einstein's transcript without knowing about this change, it might appear that he was suddenly getting terrible marks in his final year, when in fact he was excelling. There is one specific event that the myth often latches onto: Einstein's failure of an entrance exam. In 1895, at the age of 16, 2 years younger than the normal applicants, he did take the entrance examination for the prestigious Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich. And he did fail it. However, when you look at the details, the story changes. He passed the mathematics and science sections of the exam with flying colors. The parts he failed were the non-scientific subjects, French, literature, and history. The school's director was so impressed with his performance in the science sections that he encouraged Einstein to attend a local high school to round out his education, and then reapply the following year, which he did, passing with ease. The story of Einstein failing math is a classic example of a comforting myth. It's a piece of historical wishful thinking. The reality is that Einstein wasn't the late bloomer who overcame a mathematical deficiency. He was a prodigy who was a master of the subject from a very young age. Our next myth takes us to the evening of October 30th, 1938. It's the night before Halloween, and millions of Americans are gathered around their radios, the primary source of news and entertainment in the home. That night, a young, ambitious, and already famous radio dramatist named Orson Welles and his Mercury Theatre on the Air are performing a special holiday broadcast, an adaptation of H.G. Wells's classic science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds. The story we have all been told is that Wells's production was so terrifyingly realistic, so cleverly formatted as a series of live news bulletins interrupting a program of dance music, that it fooled a huge portion of the American public into believing that the Earth was actually being invaded by Martians. The result, the legend says, was a night of unprecedented, nationwide mass hysteria. People screamed in the streets. Roads were clogged with families trying to flee the alien invaders. Phone lines were jammed as terrified citizens called the police and newspapers for information. It was, supposedly, the night that a radio show panicked a nation. This story of mass panic has become a landmark in the history of media. It is held up as the ultimate example of the power of broadcasting to influence and manipulate the public. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of fake news and the gullibility of the masses. It is a dramatic and unforgettable event, and it has been profoundly and demonstrably exaggerated. The idea of a nationwide panic is a myth that was born and nurtured by the newspaper industry. In the 1930s, radio was a new and disruptive technology, and it was siphoning advertising revenue away from traditional print media. Newspapers saw radio as a dangerous and unregulated rival, and the War of the Worlds broadcast was the perfect opportunity to discredit it. In the days following the broadcast, newspapers across the country seized upon the story, running sensationalist, front-page headlines like, "Radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact," and "Radio fake scares nation." They cherry-picked the most extreme examples of frightened listeners and presented them as the norm, creating the impression of a widespread, national hysteria. The reality was far more subdued. First, the audience for the broadcast was, in relative terms, quite small. The Mercury Theatre was a highbrow, sustaining show, meaning it didn't have a commercial sponsor, and it was scheduled opposite one of the most popular and beloved programs in the country, The Chase and Sanborn Hour, a comedy variety show starring the ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy, Charlie McCarthy. The vast majority of the radio-listening public was listening to Charlie McCarthy, not Orson Welles. Second, the show itself contained multiple, clear disclaimers. It was introduced as a dramatization of H.G. Wells's novel. There were announcements at the commercial breaks identifying it as a production of the Mercury Theatre. While the news bulletin format was clever, many listeners who tuned in late and missed the introduction were simply confused, not terrified. They called their local stations or police departments to ask what was going on, which contributed to the stories of jammed phone lines. But a call for information is not the same as a call of panic. There were certainly some people who were genuinely frightened, particularly in a few specific areas like Grover's Mill, New Jersey, which was named in the broadcast as the Martian landing site. But the idea of millions of people running for the hills is a fiction, a media-driven exaggeration that served the interests of the newspaper industry. The panic was not a national event, it was a media event, a legend that Orson Welles, a master showman, was more than happy to play along with for the rest of his career. We end our entire journey with a myth not from human history, but from the natural world. It is a story that has become a powerful and often used metaphor in our language. When we want to describe a group of people blindly following a leader or a trend towards a disastrous outcome, we say they are acting like lemmings. The image this phrase conjures is a dramatic and tragic one. We picture the vast, frozen landscapes of the Arctic tundra. A massive horde of small, furry rodents called lemmings is on the move. Driven by some mysterious, innate, and self-destructive instinct, they march in a straight line, an unstoppable river of fur. Their march leads them to the edge of a towering seaside cliff. Without hesitation, the leaders plunge over the edge, and the thousands behind them follow suit, a cascade of bodies tumbling into the churning ocean below. It is a spectacle of mass, programmed suicide, a bizarre and unsettling ritual of nature. This idea of lemming suicide is one of the most famous and enduring myths about animal behavior. It has been referenced in countless cartoons, movies, and even video games. It is a powerful metaphor for mindless conformity. It is also a complete and utter fabrication, a cruel piece of cinematic fraud that has slandered the reputation of a small rodent for over 60 years. The myth can be traced directly to a single, influential source: the 1958 Walt Disney nature documentary, White Wilderness. The film, part of Disney's True Life Adventures series, won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. It contains the now infamous sequence that created the myth. The narrator, in a somber tone, describes the lemmings' mysterious death march to the sea. We see dozens, then hundreds of lemmings scurrying across the tundra, culminating in the shocking scene where they plummet from a high cliff into the water below. But the scene was a lie. The entire sequence was staged. An investigation by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in the 1980s revealed the truth. The segment was not filmed in a coastal area, but in landlocked Alberta, Canada, a region with no native lemming population. The filmmakers had imported a few dozen lemmings from Manitoba. To create the effect of a massive migration, they used clever camera angles and placed the animals on a large, snow-covered turntable that was spun around to make them look dizzy and frantic. The final, horrifying scene of this suicide was created by the film crew physically herding and chasing the terrified animals off the edge of a cliff into a river below. So what is the real story of lemming behavior? Lemmings are small rodents whose populations experience dramatic boom and bust cycles. Every 3 to 4 years, their numbers can explode, leading to overcrowding and a scarcity of food. When this happens, they are forced to migrate in large groups to find new, less populated areas with more resources. During these frantic migrations, they are focused on moving forward. They can swim and will often cross rivers or lakes to get to the other side. The suicidal behavior is a tragic misinterpretation of these migrations. When a massive group of lemmings reaches a body of water too wide to cross, or the edge of a steep cliff, the sheer pressure from the thousands of lemmings pushing from behind can accidentally shove the ones at the front over the edge. It is not a conscious act of suicide, but an accidental death caused by the momentum of a desperate crowd. The Disney film took this natural, albeit sometimes tragic, behavior and twisted it into a sensational and completely fictional narrative of self-destruction. And so, our journey comes to an end. We have traveled from the sands of the Roman Colosseum to the plains of the American West, from the halls of Versailles to the surface of the moon. We have seen how propaganda, misunderstanding, folklore, and pure fiction can become cemented in our minds as historical fact. The myths we've explored today are more than just trivia. They show us that history is not a static collection of names and dates, but a living, breathing story that is constantly being told and retold. And like any story, it can be shaped by the biases, the motives, and the imaginations of the storytellers. The real lesson is not just that Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, or that Einstein was great at math. The real lesson is the importance of curiosity and critical thinking. It's a reminder to always ask questions, to look for the evidence, and to be willing to challenge the stories that we think we know best. Because the truth is often more complex, more nuanced, and far more fascinating than the myth. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of Unbelievable Myths History Got Wrong. If you enjoyed this journey down the historical rabbit hole, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments, what other historical myths do you want to see us tackle next? Until then, keep questioning.